Imagine spending your entire life defending the idea that thinking clearly is not a threat to your faith. It is an expression of it. Imagine rising to become the chief judge of one of the greatest cities in the medieval world, serving as personal physician to a caliph and writing over 100 books. And then imagine watching your books get publicly burned, being driven out of your own city by an angry crowd, being exiled and disgraced in the final years of your life. That was the reality of Ibn Rushd. And today on Muslim Biographies, we are going to explore why this man, despite everything done to silence him, went on to shape the entire intellectual foundation of Western Europe. Welcome back to Muslim Biographies, where we bring the stories of Islam's greatest figures to life. Today's story is one of the most dramatic we have covered. It is about the tension between reason and religion, about political power and intellectual courage, and about a man whose ideas outlasted every attempt to destroy them. Let us get into it. Ibn Rushd was born on the 14th of April, 1126 in Córdoba. At that time, the intellectual capital of Islamic Spain and one of the most sophisticated cities in the world. His full name was Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd. In the Western world, he became known as the Commentator. His family was extraordinary. His grandfather was the Chief Judge of Córdoba and the Imam of the Great Mosque. His father held the same judicial position after him. 3 generations of chief judges, 3 generations of men who understood the law, the faith, and the weight of public responsibility. Ibn Rushd grew up inside that legacy, and he exceeded it. He was a true polymath. Philosophy, Islamic law, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, physics. He did not dabble in these fields. He mastered them. And the central question this episode is going to explore is, how does a man of that caliber end up with his books in flames? His education was exceptional. He studied hadith, Maliki jurisprudence, theology and medicine. He memorized his father's copy of Imam Malik's Muwatta. He attended regular philosophical gatherings in Seville alongside scholars, physicians and the future caliph himself. These were the circles that would shape the rest of his life. Now here is something important. Ibn Rushd was not some reckless freethinker who abandoned his religious commitments for Greek philosophy. He was a deeply observant Muslim, a qualified judge, and a scholar of Islamic law who genuinely believed that reason and revelation were not enemies. They were 2 paths leading to the same truth. That conviction, held firmly and argued brilliantly, is what made him both extraordinary and dangerous in certain eyes. In 1169, he was introduced to the Almohad Caliph Abu Yaqub Yusuf through the philosopher Ibn Tufail. The caliph opened their first conversation by asking whether the heavens had existed since eternity or had a beginning, one of the most contested questions in all of theology. Ibn Rushd was initially afraid to answer, but when the caliph began discussing Plato, Aristotle, and the Muslim philosophers himself, Ibn Rushd realized he was in the presence of a genuine intellectual. He explained his views. The caliph was deeply impressed, and from that meeting came a commission that would echo across centuries to write commentaries on the entire body of Aristotle's work and make it accessible. That commission changed the history of Western thought, but it also set Ibn Rushd on a collision course with those who believed that philosophy itself was a threat to Islam. The most dramatic intellectual battle of Ibn Rushd's life was not with Aristotle. It was with al-Ghazali, one of the most influential Islamic scholars who had ever lived. Al-Ghazali had written a devastating critique of Islamic philosophy called Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. In it, he argued that the philosophers had produced ideas that contradicted Islamic theology, and that those who followed them were guilty of unbelief. Ibn Rushd's response was titled Tahafut al-Tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence, a direct, unapologetic intellectual counterstrike. He argued that al-Ghazali had fundamentally misunderstood what the philosophers were actually saying, and that rational inquiry and religious revelation were not in conflict, but were 2 paths to the same truth. He went even further in his work, the Fasl al-Maqal, the decisive treatise. There he argued that the Quran itself instructs us to think, to reflect, to examine the world around us. The Quranic injunction to travel the earth and reflect was, for Ibn Rushd, a divine intellectual mandate. Philosophy, properly understood, was not an alternative to faith. It was a deeper expression of it. That argument was not universally accepted in his time, but it is one that resonates powerfully today. In an era where the relationship between faith and reason is still fiercely contested, Ibn Rushd was ahead of his era by centuries, and now we come to the part of this story that is genuinely difficult to tell. Despite everything, the judicial career, the royal patronage, the 100 books, the brilliant defenses of philosophy, Ibn Rushd's life ended in disgrace. In 1195, various charges were made against him. A tribunal in Córdoba tried him, condemned his teachings, ordered the burning of his works, and banished him to the nearby town of Lucena. His writings were banned, his books were burned. Conservative religious factions who had long resented the court's tolerance of philosophy had finally succeeded in bringing him down. Some of the charges against him were almost certainly fabricated by rivals who wanted him gone. On one occasion, he was reportedly driven from the Mosque of Córdoba by an angry crowd. The man who had served as its chief judge, who had spent his entire career defending the compatibility of Islam and rational thought, was now being hounded from the streets of the city he had served. The irony of that moment is almost unbearable. He returned to Córdoba 2 years later when the ban was lifted, but he died within a year of his return, in December 1198. He was 72 years old, and he died knowing that in the Muslim world, the battle he had fought for philosophy had been lost. Here is where the story takes its most extraordinary turn, because everything that Ibn Rushd's contemporaries tried to bury, every book they burned, every argument they condemned, survived. And not just survived, it transformed the world. Through Latin translations of his Aristotle commentaries, Western European scholars encountered Greek philosophy for the first time in centuries. His medical textbook was used across Europe until the advent of modern investigative science. A movement grew up around his ideas called Latin Averroism, with followers at the University of Paris challenging established theological doctrine using his methods. Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the greatest Christian theologian of the medieval period, engaged extensively with Ibn Rushd's work, building on it and arguing against it in equal measure. Dante placed him in the Divine Comedy among the greatest philosophers of antiquity. Raphael included him in the School of Athens, his famous fresco, alongside Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and Pythagoras. A Muslim scholar from 12th century Andalusia, immortalized in the greatest painting of the Italian Renaissance. That is the measure of his impact. And here is the final irony. The ideas that conservative religious authorities burned in Córdoba in 1195 went on to help ignite the European Renaissance, the movement that gave birth to modern science, modern philosophy, and the Enlightenment was, in no small part, built on the intellectual foundations laid by Ibn Rushd. They tried to end his legacy. Instead, they pushed it westward, where it caught fire. Ibn Rushd's life asks a question that is just as urgent today as it was in the 12th century. What do we do when rigorous thinking makes powerful people uncomfortable? His answer was to keep going, to keep writing, keep arguing, keep defending the idea that a Muslim who thinks clearly is not betraying their faith. They are honoring it. He paid a heavy personal price for that conviction, but history vindicated him in the most extraordinary way. The ideas they tried to burn came back and lit up an entire civilization. That is the kind of legacy that no decree, no exile, and no bonfire can erase. If this episode has added something to your understanding, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are not yet subscribed to Muslim Biographies, now is the time. Every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories of Muslim scholars and visionaries whose contributions shape the world but whose names are too often forgotten. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us on this journey, because there are so many more extraordinary stories still to tell, and we are just